Welcome, one and all. This video is an introduction to my new educational video series, based on my upcoming book titled Natural Law Essay and Critique. The video series will not only supplement the book, but will also present the information in a more simplified and general way. This book will hopefully be published in the next few months, and in the meantime, I will be presenting two videos, this introductory one, and then episode 1 titled Holistic Consciousness. My upcoming book will consist of two sections: the natural law essay, which can be considered a work unto itself, and then the second part, which is the critique of Western philosophy, focusing on three prominent thinkers of our times: Stefan Molyneux, Jordan Peterson, and Ken Wilber. I will include the three latest works of these thinkers: Stefan Molyneux's The Art of the Argument, Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, and Ken Wilber's The Religion of Tomorrow. While the focus will be on these three thinkers, I will include other philosophers and philosophies that they resonate with, from Greek to postmodern evolutionary theory. If you are familiar with these thinkers, then this will be particularly relevant to you, as many are starting to wake up to the fact that the deep thinkers of our times are missing something vital, and they are. It's natural law. But even if you aren't familiar with these thinkers, this critique will be addressing the cul-de-sacs and dead ends of false ideology from an imbalanced dualistic consciousness as to include the history of Western philosophy. And this is particularly relevant to anyone living in the Western world. In order to free the mind, it helps to critically examine the errors of the ideologies that have enslaved the mind, which is why critique is essential. It is also important to distinguish between what these thinkers got right, as they have value to contribute to the world, and how they fall short of natural law, true philosophy. In this book series, we are seeking to de-occult and deconstruct the Western mind, to dissect all of its trappings, misunderstandings, and misconceptions linked to lower, non-holistic consciousness, so that we may arrive at the first principles of the cosmos. My goal is to make this information available to all levels of philosophy, from beginners to advanced, and as a multimedia artist, I hope to present the information in various formats as to trigger the unconscious in various ways to help the development of holistic consciousness towards truth, freedom, and morality, as to clarify the intuitive knowing of the noetic self and its origin in natural law. In this introductory video, I will be using my book title picture as a diagram to quickly and casually discuss the philosophers and philosophies in a freestyle manner that will be broken down in the future in depth into structured, compact, and creative format. This creative format will be used in my next video, so be sure to subscribe and receive notifications if this is something you are interested in. And for anyone new to my channel, this work is based on the Hermetic teachings of the Kybalion and the aggregated information by de-occultist Mark Passio, so be sure to watch his natural law seminar and all of his other videos, and go through his podcast starting with number 1. If you already understand natural law principles, then it is important to start to, or to continue to spread this information, as to uplift the vibration of this planet and to free humanity from the chains of ignorance. The One Great Work Network is a group of individuals independently creating content and collaborating with each other to offer mutual support in spreading the occult knowledge of natural law. The following presentation is stream of consciousness, so it is a bit disorganized, but I hope it will give people a sneak peek into the future topics to be covered, and also I encourage you to do your own research on them. Also, a quick note that sometimes the image and the words on the screen will be different from what I'm saying, and that's because I want people to get used to the idea of correspondence and the many different ways to articulate one concept. And so I want this to be more of a holistic presentation, but I will in the future get into the specific definitions of each term and their differences. Okay, this is the Western historical timeline of philosophy, beginning in 600 BC to the present moment. Basically, you could break up this timeline into three epochs: pre-modern, which means before modern, modern, and then postmodern. And here we have to be concerned about the semantic issue with postmodern, because here we mean it after modern. But postmodern can also mean the postmodern movement with the critical theorists and the French post-structuralists. But generally, there are characteristics of postmodern philosophy in contrast to the other eras. This just has to be clarified. The pre-modern era began with the pre-Socratic philosophers like Thales and Anaxagoras. Pre-Socratics means before Socrates, but Socrates is considered basically the beginning of Western philosophy in Athens, Greece. And we have Socrates and his student Plato, and then Plato and his student Aristotle. And then we have the Roman Empire beginning around 300 AD into about 450 AD. And then the medieval period. All of this can be also considered the Middle Ages. So we want to carefully distinguish between two aspects of the pre-modern, which I'm going to be focusing in my book. And this is between traditional orthodoxy that began with Constantine and the merge of the Christian religion with the Roman state. And we need to differentiate between that and the classical philosophers. The classical philosophers sought true metaphysics and knowledge. They were against dogma, which is why Socrates was tried by the state. The state does not want true philosophers because true philosophy is opposed to the tenets of the state, which are immoral. But sadly, we have the social engineers and the politicians and the dark occultists seek to suppress humanity with the traditional orthodoxy. And sadly, the medieval theologians were compromised to a certain extent because of that. And we have St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas are the two main ones. Thomas Aquinas, he understood natural law concepts. He understood that man's law should not deviate from natural law. And if it is, it should not be obeyed. Yet at the same time, he believed that heretics should be killed by the state. And heretics are basically those who don't believe in the state or in man's law. So unfortunately, we have those types of contradictions, and that is why this period sometimes is called the Dark Ages. Now, with Italian Renaissance in the 1400s, we have this break-free spirit from traditional orthodoxy in this rise of individualism and of humanism and of rationalism. What followed is the Age of Reason with modern science, Francis Bacon here, and the European Enlightenment. With that also came a different political and economic structure, which is capitalism and national democracies in contrast to feudalism. After modern, in the postmodern era, there was this critique of modernity in seeing how modernity didn't really bring a real enlightenment, but kind of a false one, in that, like Karl Marx saw, that capitalism was really another system of slavery. Marx looked at the alienation and the exploitation of man. I would consider Karl Marx as that transition from modern to postmodern, and then Friedrich Nietzsche was really the one who commenced the postmodern era. And he was not only critical of traditional orthodoxy, God is dead, but he was very critical of the Enlightenment. The liberation of the Enlightenment seemed to be more about power and quote-unquote rational self-interest in materialistic and political pursuits. And the philosophers were quite keen on this negative undertow of the Enlightenment, which generated a climate of pessimism. And so you see how that led to nihilism and existentialism. Okay, here is another timeline that I pulled off the web, and this fleshes out the last one into more detail. And essentially all of this here I lump into pre-modern, ancient, Hellenistic, which also means Greek, Roman, medieval, Renaissance. And that is because most of our present-day thinkers are modern or postmodern thinkers. There's this kind of bashing of the past, especially with evolutionary theories that believe that the movement in time means better. And that's not necessarily the case. Humans can regress, and we're seeing a lot of that. I would consider Stefan Molyneux to be a modern empiricist, so I place him here. I consider Peterson to be in that transition from modern to postmodern. He's into existentialism, phenomenology, and also pragmatism. I would consider Wilber to be postmodern to post-postmodern, which includes the New Age, cybernetic systems theory, peak state experiences, which was really popular with the New Age. So hopefully the last two timelines I've showed you will help to give this picture context And this is a picture for my book cover, as I am giving you a sneak peek of what is to come. So I generally follow the timeline, but as you can see, two individuals are strikingly out of place, like Ayn Rand and Mark Passio. And I'm going to describe why they are out of place. But for now, let me just quickly start with the timeline. And here we have the pre-Socratics, Heraclitus and Parmenides, Socrates, Plato and Aristotle, the medieval St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. And then here is modernity. This is the transition from modernity to postmodernity, and then postmodernity. Here's Descartes, the rationalist, Hume, the empiricist, Bacon, the empiricist. Locke was confused, and so was Kant. They ended up being more empiricist than rationalist, although they tried to be rationalist in some ways. Locke understood natural law, which is a rational principle and not an empirical, tangible object. While rationalism and empiricism can be used as a false dialectic and controlled opposition between the mind and sense, generally, rationalism is more true than empiricism based on its understanding that there does exist principles of reason. Basically, the rationalists hold that objective reality is independent from the senses, but the empiricists hold the premise that truth can only be found in the senses. So this is where Molyneux reveals that he's an empiricist because he believes that truth has to be a physical, tangible object, and that, even destroys the notion of first principles, which are understood a priori and unto reason themselves, which Kant understood, but he couldn't accept its truth, so he created the theory that the a priori was simply the structure of man's mind, but that it had no relation to the real noumena or objective reality, which is a schism. But Molyneux tries to play rationalist like Ayn Rand, who in the 1970s brought back Aristotelian thought, who's right here in Metaphysical Realism, which states that objective reality is independent from man's perception. This is one reason why I put Mark next to Rand, but mainly above the pre-modern philosophers who understood the tenet of objective reality and metaphysical realism, being independent from perception. So Molyneux tries to have his cake and eat it too, but these are two contradictory premises, because once you understand that objective reality is independent from the senses, then you cannot reduce reality to the senses. And you are not going to find rational first principles in sense perception directly. The framework to interpret sense perception is higher and independent than sense perception, and this is why Molyneux will struggle to fully grasp what first principles are. For example, true freedom is an absolute principle that is known through the mind, as it can only manifest in relative degree. Jumping ahead to postmodernity in about the 1950s, we have the logical positivists, which can be considered the new empiricists, drawing from Hume, Bacon, Kant, etc. We have Bertrand Russell, Alfred North Whitehead, and Wittgenstein, who was Russell's protege. Russell would eventually denounce the existence of numbers in classes and any abstract notion, kind of like what Molyneux does. Here we have John Locke, who got close to natural law understanding, as I just said. That provided the foundation for the American Constitution and the understanding of natural law rights that are intrinsic to humanity as bestowed by our Creator. Here is Thomas Paine, who helped to implement natural law into the Constitution as one of the founding fathers. Here we have the evolutionary theorists, Hegel, the German idealist, Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, who took Hegel's ideas of evolution and applied it to economics. And then this is Julian Huxley, who took evolutionary theory and applied it to the political domain, and he is connected with the elite. Julian Huxley was been head of UNESCO, a United Nations organization. So we can see how these evolutionary theories actually feed in to the control system and into social engineering. And I'm going to go into that. And I would say that Hegel and Darwin are definitely the foundation for Ken Wilber, and then also these postmodern evolutionary theorists. Charles Darwin is a pivotal point for all three of them. We will also be looking at how Charles Darwin's evolutionary theory is based in relativism, and how whether you take evolution as a random mutation or even creative novelty, that without being in the context of natural law, they are relativistic. Here, Jordan Peterson draws from phenomenologists, and here we have Husserl and Heidegger. And the phenomenology camp was a precursor to existentialism. Phenomenology and existentialism focused on experience and perception, which challenged metaphysical realism. Here is Friedrich Nietzsche and Dostoevsky, the Russian novelist, both of which Peterson tends to resonate with. Dostoevsky wrote War and Peace, is a Russian novelist, but he tends to discuss philosophical concepts, especially in regards to morality. And so I will be doing a comparison between Nietzsche and him in the book. And then I put Schopenhauer here because he was a big influence on Nietzsche and kind of started the trend of romantic irrationalism that I will go into. Then, because Peterson is a clinical psychologist, which makes it a little bit unfair for me to critique him through the philosophical lens, but I feel like it needed to be done because he discusses so many philosophical concepts. But philosophy has also been the foundation for psychology. The psychological camp is included here, and we have modern psychology beginning in Germany with William Wundt, and this is dividing the psyche from the soul and treating man as an animal to be controlled. This is B.F. Skinner. And then we have Piaget, the developmental theorist that studied children's development and cognitive development. Wow, so I just realized that I forgot Sigmund Freud, who I believe I can make some room for if I just scoot Schopenhauer and William James over a bit, put him right here. And he is important for the notion of the unconscious and repressed drives. Then we have Carl Jung, who can be considered the most holistic out of a lot of these individuals. And he got into the unconscious archetypes. And then we have Carl Rogers of humanistic psychology. This is person-centered therapy. Then we have William James here as the main pragmatist. There's also Charles Peirce, which maybe I'll fit in here later. But Peterson generally draws from pragmatism and Darwinism. And I'm going to assess how pragmatic Darwinism actually is not compatible with the Jungian archetypes or with the logos. Peterson believes that morality emerged from evolution in terms of what works in social interactions and finding that equilibrium between cooperation and individuality. But this is essentially moral relativism. So I'm going to go into that. And down here we have the postmodernists, the Frankfurt critical theorists, Adorno and Horkheimer, and then our postmodernists, I put an American postmodernist, Richard Rorty, and then also the French in the 1970s, Michel Foucault, and then Derrida, looking quite fashionable there. All three of these philosophers tend to be very critical of postmodernism. I'm going to show how Wilber still falls into the traps of postmodern thinking as he desires to transcend and include postmodern relativism, which isn't something you can do because you should not include what is false. But I am also going to show how, in addition to Wilber, Molyneux and Peterson fall into the ideology of relativism. I appreciate Wilber's motive of going back through the history of philosophy and trying to integrate these ideologies. Like, he had the right motive with sex ecology and spirituality, but since then he is trying to promote this integral religion. Now, in many ways, Wilber can be considered the antithesis to Molyneux because he does attempt to be spiritual, and out of the three, Wilber ends up being the one to create a religion. Religion is the result of false spirituality when you do not have natural law understanding, and religion supports the control system and the lower consciousness. So his work would be very resonant to the mission of the Club of Rome. Right here, I have a Club of Rome member, Erwin Laszlo, and if you don't know the Club of Rome, you definitely want to study it, and that is a political elite organization that is using evolutionary theory to create the one world government, the technocracy of transhumanism, and that essentially began with Julian Huxley, who's known for coining the term transhumanism. So Laszlo was a systems theorist, and all of this feeds in to the plans of the elite. And here we have Gregory Bateson, who was part of the Cybernetics Club, Aldous Huxley, who was as well, and also part of the MK Ultra experiments of seeking altered state consciousness to be used for mind control. This camp also brought about Esalen in the schools in California with Berkeley and the California Institute of Integral Studies, who's also involved with the New Age movement. Here we have Aurobindo, who was an Indian political activist, and he came to America and brought in Eastern meditation, and that combined with the New Age. And then we have this influx of New Age cults like Adi Da, who would abuse this guru-student relationship for power and lust. And Wilber actually draws a lot from Adi Da. He's kind of a synthesis between Adi Da, Aurobindo, and Laszlo. And also Bateson, the cybernetic, the systems theory part of his theory. And then down here, Wilber especially draws from these individuals Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who is a Jesuit priest into evolutionary theory, and then Claire Graves in the 1950s. Graves' theory is called the emergent cyclical double helix model of adult biopsychosocial systems development. They're trying to be holistic about their systems theory. We have Jean Gapser. This is Don Beck, who is Claire Graves' protege. They basically created a theory of the stages of man, that man evolves through these certain stages. While that is true, that evolution is a fact of reality, they would organize it in a certain way that would promote the control system. And so it is no surprise that Don Beck actually works with the United Nations. So evolutionary theory is used to rope people into occulted political agendas under the guise of evolving consciousness, being on the leading edge, for business and management and leadership programs. But this is really serving the agenda of the control system and the false belief in authority. And the last person here that I haven't named is the Dalai Lama, who I have here representing the New Age as a Club of Rome member. Going back to Mark Passio, as I said earlier, I placed him here because he resonates with true metaphysics. Although you could also place him here with the Founding Fathers, I should put Samuel Adams in here. Heraclitus discovered natural law. He called it the logos, the law of reason. The idea of a cosmic principle of morality is the basis for pre-modern metaphysics. And I feel that got corrupted with the church, that the advancements of philosophy were a threat to the political power, and that's why the suppression with the church came along. This is not to say that the classical thinkers weren't flawed, because they certainly were. Like Plato with his ideal state. Aristotle was no saint, and he believed that women and slaves were inferior, as well as non-Greeks. And that part tends to resemble Molyneux and his European right pride, in which he believes that the non-Europeans are like barbarians that want to cross the borders and take over. There's a little tinge of the elitism and aristocracy like Aristotle in Molyneux's work. But they had their minds in the right direction. The beginning of the search for knowledge and truth, which is why we have the resurgence of classical thought with Ayn Rand's objectivism. But she did not like Plato, nor does her protege Leonard Peikoff like Plato or Molyneux. And Plato is the philosopher that spoke of the existence of an absolute good. And the absolute good can be correlated to natural law. So without the absolute good, Ayn Rand interprets freedom as the expression of rational self-interest in a capitalist society, because she does not understand what true altruism is. And true altruism is the service to truth rather than service to the ego, and is the alignment of the will to the higher good. But you have to understand the occult and alchemy and the transformation of consciousness from lower to higher. The empiricists tend to reject the notion of transformation of consciousness and alchemy. The empiricists are skeptical of consciousness, its nature and aspects, because it cannot be seen, while the postmodern evolutionary theorists are very into that concept, but they tend to understand it from a very empirical perspective. Evolutionary theory is based on historical relativism, believing that the stages of man are the metaphysical conditions of man, and they're not. The metaphysical conditions are trans-historical. They're independent of time in man's unfolding. Man can go in circles and can regress and cannot evolve through time. Or man can discover truth in objective reality, in objective morality, and become more in alignment to what is already pre-existing as the nature of the cosmos. The cosmos has a design that's outside of man's own conception or projected idea. Even though all of these thinkers have something valuable to contribute and saw partial truths that we're going to go into, in the early stages of modernity, we have scientism and empiricism that reduced reality to matter. And then the new empiricists, who also denounced the notion of abstract principles. We have the evolutionary theorists in modernity that's based in historical relativism, and the new evolutionary theorists that is also based on the same. And then the postmodernists is very clearly relativistic with the belief that truth is subjective. The same with the phenomenologists and the existentialists. So essentially we're just simplifying the understanding of bad ideology as relativism and materialism in contrast to the higher principles of natural law.